Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. For those who have spotted this already, I've already moved from the title on the programme in front of you to a new title. But in fact, I'll be saying things that could fit under both titles this morning. What I really want to stress is the notion of transformations and transitions. First of all, in the sense that the PhD, as well as the professional doctorate, as well as practice-based doctorates, are undergoing rapid processes of transformation. So we're not just talking about the introduction of new types of doctorates, we're also talking about the transformation of old types of doctorates. And secondly, the idea of learning transitions, which I think are implicit in the notion of doing doctoral study. So both of those words for me are key to trying to understand the notion of doctoral education. But before I begin, perhaps I can say something very much about the field itself, because it has developed to such an extent that we are beginning to establish doctoral education as a field. There is a journal, for example. There is an international conference. There is clearly all sorts of SIGs belonging to various other organizations. So it is developing in that sense. There's a great deal of writing about the PhD, the traditional PhD, and of course professional doctorates, practice-based doctorates, and so on. And the other important aspect, I think, is that governments over the last 20 years, or 15 years, are beginning to take a much closer interest in the PhD and doctoral education in general. It's taken them some time, but clearly in the sense that governments are now much more keen to intervene, if you like, in matters to do with higher education. And of course, in the UK, we're going to be struck by some much more significant interventions in financial terms over the next few years, which are going to transform, if you like, our practice. Whether, of course, the interventions by government have actually had much of an effect or not, I think, is a different matter. But what they're concerned about is the quality and standards of the awards themselves. Or at least that's what they say they're concerned about. Because you could also argue that there are certain moves, perhaps, by governments, by government, quasi-government bodies, to actually diminish the quality and standard of the award itself. Secondly, they are concerned about, or they were concerned, about the narrow and specialist nature of the inquiry undertaken by students. In other words, the old PhD was too disciplinary orientated, didn't have enough breadth, didn't equip the student, if you like, to go on in the world. It was purely academic, and that worried them. So they were worried about the restricted disciplinary orientation of the degree. They were worried about the very much individualized and non-collaborative nature of the pedagogy offered on the PhD program. I remember when I did my PhD nearly 20 years ago, I had one tutor. I didn't attend any courses. There was no team to look after me, that is, team of supervisors. I saw my tutor for about an hour in 5 years. That's 1 hour in 5 years. And he let me get on with it. And in the end, it was okay. But that as a form of pedagogy is very different from the form of pedagogy which now exists, clearly on professional doctorates, practice-based doctorates, and of course the PhD itself. So clearly there has been a dramatic overhaul, if you like, of the pedagogy employed. And therefore, of course, I would argue the type of knowledge that is being developed on the PhD, on the professional doctorate, and so forth. Because I think there is a very close connection between the two. Governments were concerned about the non-transferability of skills that were developed during the PhD, and this, of course, is familiar to anyone concerned with policy, or especially government policy. They were concerned about the fact that the PhD had no relevance to the needs of the economy. Now, of course, it's very easy to suggest that practice-based doctorates and professional doctorates have now filled that gap. We've now solved that problem. They are now suitable for the needs of the economy. But I think that's much too simple, much too crass, if you like. Certainly, there are people who could be doing the old-fashioned, if you like, PhD under the guise of a professional doctorate, and vice versa as well. So there is if you like, a mixture of reasons for doing professional doctorates, practice-based doctorates, and PhDs, and there is, if you like, some erosion of the boundaries between the three of them. Not least, of course, because the PhD is now, I mean, people who are doing PhDs are now required to do some taught courses. And that's a marker, if you like, of the professional doctorate, which has moved, if you like, onto the PhD. Okay, let me just say something very much, first of all, about the professional doctorates, which have now been in existence, I suppose, in this country for about 20 years. The UK, very much a late developer. First professional doctorate, Bristol EdD, Manchester EngD, that's the engineering doctorate, in 1992. And the EdD is now offered in about 35 UK universities. But I would say that of those 35 universities, some have enthusiastically embraced the idea of a professional doctorate, and then after a bit not been able to recruit and abandoned the idea of a professional doctorate in education. And all the while, other universities are coming on stream and so on. So it is a changing, moving scene in terms of the professional doctorate. So other forms of the doctorate, I mean, the ones that concern, I suppose, us most here should be certainly the old-fashioned PhD, the generic professional doctorate, the PhD, the professional doctorate, and practice-based doctorates. But again, the boundaries between some of these different categories are being eroded. So there are different forms of doctorate. I mean, the one I haven't mentioned there, of course, is PhD by published work, which is an interesting byproduct of PhD study. But it doesn't actually involve many of the themes, if you like, that I'm going to be talking about, many of the themes to do with doctoral study, because it's basically set within the discipline and it's about already published work. It's not about, if you like, practice, the practice of the person who's doing the PhD. So, what are some of the characteristics? Of course, the first characteristic is the taught component. But you'll find again that there are different types of courses being taught. Some are very much based on the notion of practice. Some are very much based on the notion of theory. There is a sequent series of progression and exit points throughout the program. In other words, the time element is being reconfigured, both on the PhD and on professional doctorates. So whereas when I did my PhD, it was a very loose arrangement. The regulatory system, if you like, was very loose. I saw my tutor when it suited him and me. There was an upgrading process, but that was really the only point at which the university itself intervened in the process of doing the PhD. Now, if you think about the professional doctorate, there are various types of courses, there are various hurdles to leap over, there are various points during the process of getting your professional doctorate, which means that the time of the PhD candidate is controlled to a much greater extent. There are systems now for overseeing the work of the student to a greater degree, and there is a much shorter dissertation. Now, I think we need to consider, if you like, some of the implications of these four points. What does it mean to say there's a shorter dissertation? And of course, the converse, what does it mean to say there is a longer dissertation in the PhD? Does that make the PhD a more worthy piece of work than an EdD, which is a shorter dissertation, and so on? What is the nature of the inquiry that goes into a shorter dissertation? So it's not just a question of simply saying it is a